the news itself, this report, isn't so much of a surprise because it's not the first time, obviously, that we've heard this intention or ambition from Israel, particularly from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has voiced his concerns very vocally, we know, for at least 20 years now about Iran's nuclear program. So that's not new at all. I think in this case, we have to look at the details of this story. And one of the key things is that it's coming from US intelligence. This is US intelligence sources that aren't named telling CNN that we think there are suggestions that Israel may be planning an airstrike on Iranian nuclear facilities. This in itself suggests that the US may want to make a concerted effort to an extent to separate itself from what Israel wants to do. That's one way of looking at it. The other thing that we have to consider is the context that we have, which is crucial to this kind of story, and that's obviously the fact that Iran and the US have, for the first time in a few years, started to engage in quite serious diplomatic talks over Iran's nuclear program. Those talks aren't obviously direct; they're being mediated at the moment by Oman, but when that started in April, that was seen as a huge step forward in those efforts between the two countries to kind of reduce this ongoing tension over Iran's nuclear program. So that context is key. So you have to look at whether this story is going to affect those talks, and in what way. If it's negatively seen to affect those talks, and we had comments from Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, really throwing cold water on the idea that talks can succeed. Though, immediately oil reacted and Brent turned up higher, because obviously there's an expectation that if there isn't a deal, sanctions won't be lifted on Iran and Iran's oil exports will continue to be targeted by the US Treasury. So there's a lot going on in the background, and all of it is crucial to how we interpret and look at this report.
Is there a conclusion of maybe how the US would respond to this specifically? Like, how would they maybe change their own discussions with Israel at the moment?
I think that's a really important question, because Israel is very isolated internationally because of the extent to which its bombardment of Gaza has obviously turned public opinion against Netanyahu to an extent, at least to an extent that we haven't seen before in the past. That does seem to have affected Israel's relationship with the US so far. We saw the country pretty much sidelined from Trump's trip to the Middle East last week, which was a huge deal in terms of America's relationship with Gulf Arab countries. So I think that's going to be crucial. And again, I think the fact that this is coming purportedly from US intelligence, maybe that is a sign that the US wants to distance itself even further from any ambitions that Netanyahu has, because we've seen that, there is this debate going on in Israel politically, domestically, over the relationship between Netanyahu's strategy in Gaza and his ambitions to stay in politics and to stay in power. And there's a dynamic, there's an angle that's related to that here as well with Iran. Is this maybe, if it's true, if the Israelis, if Netanyahu is indeed planning this seriously with his military colleagues, is that an effort to shift the focus of conflict and war to a new theatre so that he can maintain his position? These are questions that people are going to be asking around this report, definitely in Tehran.
I want to cite this as well in the context of what we've been hearing from Donald Trump in terms of Iran as well, and also what we heard from the Iranian Supreme Leader as well about these talks, because there did seem to be progress being made. Certainly if we listen to what Donald Trump was saying on his tour of the Middle East, it did seem that that relationship was advancing towards something.
Yes.
Is that now on pause? How does that interact with
this is another issue. I think since the beginning of the talk, or maybe since about 2 weeks ago, there's been mixed messaging, if you like, on what's been said and what's been achieved. Quite early on, I think after the first or second round of these talks, Steve Witkoff came out and said that Iran can enrich uranium, but to a very low level of purity of 3.67%. That's what Iran was already allowed to do under the previous nuclear deal that Donald Trump withdrew from in 2018. He then said, actually, they can't enrich any uranium at all, which was echoing what Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, was insisting. So they've changed their red lines in public. But Iran has suggested that the Americans are saying one thing publicly and then saying something else behind closed doors during negotiations. So I think there's... I'm not actually sure what it is, whether it's the Trump administration needing to give a certain impression publicly to voters, to diehard Republicans and Democrats who are very opposed to a nuclear deal or any kind of engagement with Iran, whether they need to keep that constituency happy, or whether there is genuine tension or disagreement within the Trump administration over where to draw its red lines with Iran in the nuclear deal and how much flexibility to show over uranium enrichment, because this uranium enrichment issue has become a major point of contention between the two sides, and that's what actually prompted Khamenei to come out yesterday and say it is, to quote, outrageous for the Americans to make these demands of us.
And does that prevent, in your eyes, the likelihood of further progress?
No,
just because Iran
not necessarily, not necessarily, because immediately in that quote, Khamenei also says, I don't know what will happen. So that is his way of saying, a not so coded way of saying, maybe it will happen. We don't know. But right now, it's his job almost to come out and inject this dose of negativity whenever he sees or he feels that the American side is pushing too hard on Iran. And so that's kind of what he did yesterday.
Okay.